Here we are at Cedar Crest, October 1st, 2003, and we're just going to have a visit with Wilma. And so we're here in a room at Cedar Crest. Okay, maybe we'll start, Wilma. What's your whole name?
What do you mean?
Your whole name, your middle name?
Wilma Irene Windal.
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 Okay.
And I was born August the 2nd, 1908 at Bradley, Illinois.
Okay.
And I was the sixth of 8 children.
Okay. And were you raised in Bradley, Illinois?
Oh, yes. I was raised in Bradley, went to school, elementary school, and graduated from Bradley High School. And I was salutatorian of my class. And I was involved in every play that they put on at the high school. And I was a musician, so I played for all assembly doings and things of that sort. I was very active when I was in school.
Well, I wanted to get a couple of the stories you told me onto tape. And maybe we'll just start with your home. Your parents' names. What was your mom's name?
My mother's name was Lorene Susan, and her maiden name was Robbins, and her father was a doctor, Dr. Ira Bellin Robbins, and her grandfather was Dr. Ray. He was a Methodist minister. In those times, he was known as a circuit rider, and Mother said that on Sunday he would ride a horse sometimes, and then drive a horse and buggy, and he had churches in Barrington, Illinois, Palatine, Illinois, and Wilton Center, Illinois. And my dad was...
That's what I can find.
My dad's name was George, Clarence George, but all the people called him Bill, and he was head of the streetcar line that ran between Kankakee and Bourbonnais, which is now pronounced Bourbonnais because it was settled. Father Marquette and Joliet came down the Kankakee River and settled in this little town. We called it Bourbonnais, but now they've taken the French pronunciation of Bourbonnais. And I said it was a home of St. Viator College, Notre Dame Convent, and St. Rose School for Boys. And my older sister attended Notre Dame Convent because she wanted to learn French. And that wasn't taught at our high school at the time. The only 2 foreign languages that were taught at Bradley High School were German and Latin. And I said she had quite a hard time getting my dad to agree to let her go to Notre Dame because it was a Catholic facility, and we were not Catholics. But she enrolled at the Notre Dame when she was in her 5th grade, and she ended up speaking beautifully Parisian French, which she spoke until the day she died.
That's great.
And
which sister was that?
That was Ines.
Ines.
The sisters always called her Inez. And she learned china painting. She learned to tan, to tat. I said there were so many gracious things that she learned at Notre Dame that weren't taught in public schools.
Right.
And when she had to come back into Bradley High School, because in order to graduate from Notre Dame, she had to become a boarder and stay there at the college, at the school, you know, day and night. And my dad wanted all of his brood home under his own room at night. And so she came back to Bradley. But when they transferred her and her grades, she had the highest grade of all the senior class, and she could have been valedictorian. But my father said that wasn't right, that she should just come in for that last year, and some person who had gone to school all 4 years at Bradley, she
would knock him out.
He didn't think it was right for her to accept that honor when there had been some persons that had been there all their lives. But it didn't matter to her. And then she went on to become a school teacher.
Well, you said you were 6th out of 8. That's quite a lot of children.
Well, I had 2 brothers and 6 girls in our family. And the oldest girl, the oldest child was my oldest sister, then my 2 brothers, and then a sister, Inez, and Clara Maud, and then Wilma, and then Genevieve Luttrell, and Elizabeth Jane. That was 6 of us. And in my husband's family, it was just the opposite. They were more boys,
Uh-huh.
and 3 sisters. And he outlived everyone in his family. And at the present time, I and an older sister who's living in Boulder, Colorado, we are the only 2 that are living.
Uh-huh.
And I am now the age that I am, and she is 3 years younger.
Uh-huh. Don't you want to say your age, Wilma?
Oh, sure,
Oh.
I'm 95. I turned 95 years old the second day of August.
Okay, I think we started that way.
Mm-hmm.
What was some of your earliest memories
Of what?
of being at home with your family?
Well,
you,
they're just
you told
all,
me some
they're
about.
just all good memories.
You told me about getting a toy stove.
Oh, yes.
I wanted to get that on tape because it was such a good story.
That was one Christmas I wanted Santa Claus to bring me because I was always in the kitchen helping my mother cook, even as a little girl. I would sit at the table and watch her roll pie crust, knead bread, and I'd think, oh, that is wonderful. She knew just how much flour, when and where and how to do it, and I always wanted to cook, so I asked Santa Claus for a stove. So he bought me a little cast iron black stove. And I was so thrilled on Christmas morning because along with the stove, there was a little holder to lift the lids up.
Uh-huh.
Everything on that little stove worked. And there was also a little wrought iron kettle and a fry pan and another pan. That was the equipment that went with the stove.
Uh-huh.
And the Christmas morning that I got it, I was just ecstatic.
You think you were about 7 or 8, or?
Oh, I don't know
Maybe
how.
about
I
10?
was just, I don't remember.
Yeah,
I was
it's
just
hard.
so thrilled. But I remember Papa sitting on the kitchen floor that Christmas morning, spreading newspaper around, and he built a fire in that stove. It had the little chimney. It was just
Uh-huh.
like the stove that my mother was cooking on, only it was just a miniature.
Uh-huh.
And he was having as much fun as I was. But as I've grown older, and I've often thought of my dear mother, how she must have felt with all those newspaper on the kitchen floor and that paper smoke coming out that little chimney, and she was trying to get breakfast. But Dad was there, so he watched everything that was going on. And I was busy using that little, what did they call it?
The turner, the spatula thing?
No, they were just like a little thing to put in the hole in each little round lid that you could lift it off of the stove.
Oh, I see, like the handle thing?
Uh-huh.
Uh-huh.
And he was busy watching what I was doing, and he was keeping an eye,
Well, I
of course.
think they just call those lifters.
I don't know. But
Uh-huh.
I can remember, I've often wondered where that stove went.
Uh-huh.
But that was one of, and then I remember the year when I was older, when I knew I wanted to teach school, and Santa Claus bought me a blackboard.
Oh.
And that was another one. We were a large family, so you can remember. Our house was a very busy, busy place. There was another thing I remembered. On that Christmas morning when I walked in, and there sat that beautiful blackboard. It was on a stand, and on the blackboard was written, "Merry Christmas to Wilma from Santa Claus." And it wasn't until years later that I realized it was my older sister, Inez, who had written that, because the convent, she had beautiful handwriting.
Uh-huh.
And I said, of all things, with Santa Claus bought me a box of white chalk and a box of colored chalk and a red and white striped eraser. And I was just thrilled out of my gourd. Oh, I'm telling you, the colored chalk, everything was just perfect.
Uh-huh.
Then when I was in high school, I was a cheerleader, and I wanted a white wool coat sweater with a rolled collar.
Uh-huh.
Because I played basketball, and I played volleyball, and I played tennis. But I wanted that white sweater with a big B on it.
Were you a cheerleader?
Oh, yes.
Oh. Uh-huh.
Mhm.
I didn't realize that before.
Honey, I was into everything. But I could recall that Christmas morning when we were all in the living room, and that older sister was passing out the gifts, and I kept waiting for that white sweater, and it didn't show, and I thought, oh, I was just heartbroken. And I just couldn't understand. Santa Claus didn't bring me that white sweater. But the funny part of it was, I was such a nosy person that my mother and my sister had hidden it because they knew that I might go snooping around and I would find it.
Uh-huh.
And at that time, we had a Davenport in our living room, which was the style at that particular time. It was made by Kraler, and it was it was leather, oak wood, and brown leather, and it had the type of back. You could lift it up, and then you could unroll it and make a bed out of it.
Uh-huh.
And that's what had happened to my sweater. They thought that they would hide it so I wouldn't find it before Christmas. But then they forgot to get it out of there for Christmas. And when they found how desolate I was because I didn't get that white sweater, then they remembered to look because they lifted that top and that white sweater was folded underneath it.
Wow.
I haven't told that story for a long time.
You had a pretty good Santa at your house, didn't you?
We had what?
A good Santa Claus.
Oh, Christmas.
And parents are getting you everything you like?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
But it was so funny that because Maud worked so closely with Mama. Maud's name was Maud Clare, and
Uh-huh.
she didn't like to be called Maud because in those days, well, I won't tell you because that's recorded, but she liked to be called Clare. But she was Mama's right-hand man because she could sew. In fact, she made the first formal I ever had for the junior prom.
Oh.
And how that.
And was she the oldest sister?
Oh, my oldest sister was Blanche.
Oh, Blanche.
And you know, she's been gone so long. And she married Henry Fritzen, who was German. And they owned the grocery store in Bradley. And, oh, gee.
And was Maud the second then?
Who?
Which order was Maud?
No.
She
There was Blanche.
Uh-huh.
And then there was Vern.
Vern.
And Floyd. And then Ines.
Okay.
And then Maud, fifth.
Okay.
And then Wilma was the sixth. And then Genevieve Luttrell was seventh. And Elizabeth Jane was eighth. I always said Elizabeth Jane, she was named after the two grandmothers.
Oh, uh-huh.
And Genevieve Luttrell, now, have you ever heard the name Luttrell? There was some French aristocracy in our family somewhere.
Uh-huh.
And the reason, I never met the lady, her name was Lee Barron, but I can remember Mama telling this when she came from France and she visited Grandma Windal, Grandma Robbins, when my mother was a girl at home and
Uh-huh.
Grandpa was a doctor. And they lived in the country, and she said Grandma always had a hired girl, to help her with the
Uh-huh.
housework. And I guess Grandma was the kind of lady that she'd always invite the hired girl to sit at the table to eat with them.
Uh-huh.
And this LeBaron was visiting, and she was visiting at their house, and when it was time to eat, they went to the table, and just as Mom always did, she invited the girl to sit. LeBaron wouldn't come to the table. Because she didn't. Sue. They always called Mama Sue. Her name was Lorena Susan, and her Papa's folks always called her Rena, but Mama's folks, Uncle Wes and all the family always called her Sue.
Uh-huh.
And then she said she wouldn't come to the table. You come to the table with the servants. And of course, Mama explained it to the girl.
Yeah.
But she just included the girl as a family. And then Mama always tells the story of this farmer that came in with a wagon load of children one day, and it was cold. And I guess they bought the whole bunch. One of them was sick or something. So while they were there, according to Mom, I suppose Grandpa cooked all of them. But when they got ready to go home, Grandma gave them a quilt to cover up with in the wagon,
Uh-huh.
because she didn't want them to go take that ride home and be cold.
Uh-huh.
And Mom always laughed when she told us that story, because she said the next time Grandma saw that quilt, they'd cut it up and made some clothes for the little girls.
Oh.
Now see, Mama told us stories that she remembered from her childhood.
Right.
But that one always
Well, I
stayed.
think they had a lot of people at that time that were traveling and looking for food or
Well, I don't.
or anything.
There were poor people then, just as there are poor people now.
Uh-huh.
But it's just like now when I used to talk to Shyla,
Uh-huh.
and well, it was Shyla because Shyla was 4 years older than Joanne. When I would tell her how Dad and I lived through the Great Depression, and the Great Depression was in 1929, And that's when I became pregnant for Shyla Jean.
Uh-huh.
And when I look back in retrospect, and I would tell Shyla some of the things about men jumping out of the windows in New York because they couldn't take losing everything they
Right.
had,
Uh-huh.
and about people not having food. And I can remember Shyla saying, "Mother, it couldn't have been that bad." And
Uh-huh.
when she said, "Mother, it couldn't have been that bad," and I thought how little she knew.
Uh-huh.
And now we're going through the same thing now with men out of work and the soup lines
Right.
and people doubling up. And if somebody had a pound of meat, the rest of the family would go to eat with them at night to share what they had.
Did you meet Leo in high school?
What?
Did you meet Leo
Uh-huh.
in high school?
Yeah, he used to come out to see when I was when I was playing on the basketball team. And goodness, we didn't look then when we were on the basketball floor like the girls do now with short shorts and tank tops. We wore black sateen bloomers and white midi blouses with a scarf tied around our neck and white tennis shoes. I always said, I'll bet we looked like a bunch of penguins out there on the floor. The bloomers, you know.
Uh-huh.
Some of the girls whose mothers could sew, they put pleats in the bloomers. And then when they'd run down the floor, the pleats would bloom out. Oh, I bet we look funny.
Uh-huh.
And I was always tall, so you know what position I played on the basketball team.
Did you play guard?
Oh, I played center,
Center. Oh.
jump center.
Uh-huh.
Because when I jumped for that ball, my arms were so long. All I had to do, I had a guard who was right over to my right.
Uh-huh.
And all I had to do was look and see if, her name was Blanche, but we called her Tom. I'd look to see her, and all I had to do was just tip that ball over to her. And she was right there waiting for it, and then she'd pass it over to the other guard, then down to the forward under the basket, and we made a basket.
Uh-huh.
Well, that was fun, too. But look at that finger.
Oh, my.
Because a lot of times, when we first started to play, we played girls' rules. And
Uh-huh.
that was
Did you break that joint of the finger?
no,
or
but a lot of times when the
so
ball would
tipped
come
over
to me,
current?
and Tom was like a boy, a man. Her name was
Uh-huh.
Tom Warman, and she was stocky. But when she'd throw that ball, it would hit the tip of my toe. Oh, I can
Yeah.
remember that finger hurting so sometime, burning.
Yeah, I suppose it'd come pretty good speed towards you.
Well, after a while, we played girls' rules. We didn't like that, and then our coach was Mr. McDougal. And after a while, we changed to boys' rules.
Uh-huh.
And then that's when I didn't have to stay right in the center of the floor. When I tipped that ball, I could follow it. But before I couldn't. He blew the whistle at me so many times, scolded me, "Do you want to ever be a basketball player? If you do, you've got to stay in where you're supposed to stay, in the center of the floor, you know, where
Uh-huh.
the jump shot." Honey, I could write a book.
You should have. I mean, we should still start one.
Huh?
We could still start one on tape.
Shyla Jean said, "Mother, if Irma Bombeck could write a book." I said, "Joanne, there was an obituary in the paper last night. I think the lady's name was Gilbertson. Did you read it?"
No, I didn't read that
It
one.
was yay long.
Uh-huh.
And I thought, why do they do that? I told Joanne, I said, I don't want an obituary put in the paper.
Well,
I
when
said,
would they do it to honor their loved one?
I know, but I said, who cares?
You
I
know?
said, all the people in my age, they don't live around here, and they're dead. Oh, there's one lady still living in Jefferson. She was a soloist at our church when I was the organist. And she and I were a team. We were called on when there would be a funeral. Will Betty and Wilma play?
Uh-huh.
Will Betty sing and will Wilma play? And we did. She was down for our 70th wedding anniversary, and the lady who lived next door to us, Betty Lippert, she and her husband were down. Betty, of course, he's dead. He worked for the city, but she and Betty came down for our 70th wedding anniversary, and for our anniversary party at Joanne's.
Uh-huh.
And she belonged to the Eastern Star. I belonged to the Star. We were both Rebecca's. And I just went, and she was in her 90s when she came down here, but she was an
Uh-huh.
excellent housekeeper. And she always looked so, they never had any children. And when we moved into the house next door to them, and I told our two little girls, I said, now, you can go to when you're riding your bikes, you can go to the edge of the garage, but don't go any farther, because Lippert's lived right next door to us. But they were an older couple, and they had no children.
Uh-huh.
And I thought, I don't know how they feel about children. And you know, little children, if you're pleasant and nice to them, they think you're going to be that way all the time. And then they'll just go blundering up to your house and hi, and maybe you older people don't feel like visiting with kids that day. So I said, you can go right up to the edge of the garage and then turn around and come down. We lived on a corner lot.
Uh-huh.
And I can remember one day, Mr. Lippert, he saw me out in the yard working, and he came up to me and he said, you think your kids are too damn good for us? And I said, Charlie, what? Well, I wanted them to come up on the porch, and they wouldn't come. They had a big screened-in porch. I wanted them to come up on the porch, and they wouldn't come. Then I had to explain to him why I had done it.
Uh-huh.
And they used, the year the child of Jean got her bicycle, we didn't want her to know. No, that was Joanne. The year the child got her record player and records, and I had no place in the house to keep it. And I know Betty took it, and when Joanne had her bicycle, they kept it over to their house until Christmas Eve. Then Leo went over and got it, so we've had I've known some lovely, lovely people in my lifetime.
Well, we're skipping ahead a little bit. We were just starting to go about when you started dating Leo. And didn't you tell me one story about him giving you a hope chest?
No, Leo never gave me a hope chest.
Okay.
My folks
What was
gave
I
me a
thinking?
hope chest.
Oh, your parents gave you one?
When I first met Leo, he was driving a Moon sedan. Now we're talking about back in the teens and early 20s.
Uh-huh.
And that was such a beautiful car. It was a real beautiful Wedgwood blue, and there was a lot of chrome on it. And it was just a beautiful car. And he was driving that car the night that I met him.
Uh-huh.
Oh, now you're taking me back, Nancy.
Yeah.
And I was in high school. And he didn't tell me his name that night. And when I got home, I was with Tom, you know, the girl I was telling you about, the guard. And we had missed the last streetcar because we had been at the armory in Kankakee doing something. I can't remember what it was. It was a program that the school put on at the armory. But by the time the program was over, we went to get the streetcar. The streetcar had stopped running for the night.
Uh-huh.
And these boys had been at the meeting. And they heard Tom and I talking, what are we going to have to walk home? And it was a distance of maybe a mile and a half. And the boy that was with Leo, his name was Bernard, he came up and he wanted to know how we were going to get to Bradley. And we said, walk. And he said, well, my friend here has a car. We'll take you home if you want to go. And Tom didn't want to go, and I said, come on, we can get home in a hurry. And it was a little after 11 o'clock.
Uh-huh.
So we got in the car, and I thought, I'd never gone with the strange boys before. And when we were when we were walking to the car, I told Tom, I said, you get in the back seat. Because I thought if I'm with the driver, he's going to be busy driving. He won't pay any attention to me. And we got in the car, and when we got in the car, we told them, and they turned around the corner on Schuyler Avenue and started toward Bradley. And as we were riding along, I asked Leo what his name was. And he said, that doesn't matter. He was stalling me. And then finally I said, well, it's okay if you don't want to tell me your name, you don't have to. And then he gave me some name, I know, but I know it wasn't Chinski. And when I heard Chinski, I thought, oh my God, I don't know what my folks are going to say about this. Because you see, Dad, the car barns were in Bradley, and a lot of the Polish and Lithuanian families, when they came to Bradley, they moved on the east side of town across the railroad tracks.
Uh-huh.
But Leo's didn't. They lived on Washington Avenue. But I didn't know that at the time. But when I heard Chinski, and I sat behind a boy in school, his name was Bob Matthews, and he was Polish. You wouldn't think so with the name Matthews. But I can remember sitting behind him in school, and when he came to school in the morning, it looked like he slept in his clothes all night, and it looked like his hair in the back, like he hadn't combed it. He just run a comb through it with water.
Uh-huh.
And I just thought, oh, I don't like those people. They're dirty. Well, isn't that awful?
Well, it was a different time, too.
Well, sure.
Was Leo your same age as you?
No, Leo was 3 years older than I was.
Oh.
But when he took me home that night, I liked the way he talked. I liked the way he said things. I liked the way he treated me. He was polite, and but I didn't have. When we got on Broadway, Tom let me do the talking. And when we got on Broadway, I said, well, he could stop and we could walk home the rest of the way. I didn't want him to know where I lived.
Oh.
And well, they take us home, and I said, no, this is fine. We're close to home. So Tom and I got out, and the boys went tootling away. And I've often thought afterward, they took that so easily that they were both gentlemen.
Uh-huh.
And they took us, and Tom and I stood there talking for a while because we didn't want to run, because I lived on Center Avenue, on North Center, and she lived on South Center.
Uh-huh.
And as I say, we stood there talking for a while because I thought if they go around the block or something, kind of keeping an eye on where we were going. But they didn't. They went their way, and we stood there for talking and talked about the big program at the Armory. And then we said good night, and she went toward South Center. Her mother was a nurse. In fact, she took care of my mother when one of the kids were born. One, John or Ted, I don't know which one it was. But
well, that was kind of cagey of you, so they didn't know where you lived.
yeah, but the next day when he went to work, I guess he was busy trying to describe the two of us to the guys at work. He worked at Kraler's at that time.
Uh-huh.
And he was just, there was no intercoms or anything like that at the time. So he was just asking the boys that lived in Bradley, or the men that worked there, if they knew two girls. He was trying to catch up on us at that. I don't know if Benny was Bernard's nickname. I don't know if he was concerned about Tom, but I know Leo was concerned about me, who I was, where I lived, what I was doing. But he finally got a hold of one boy that said, yeah, he thought he knew who I was. I thought my dad was a big shot with the streetcar company. And he put two and two together, and then after that, every once in a while, I'd see that blue moon going up Center Avenue or kind of going around the neighborhood. But he never stopped and never...
He's probably looking for you.
Yeah, he was. He was.
Do you remember when he asked you out the first time?
I don't remember.
Oops. Sorry, we're getting down on
The thing that I do remember, you see, I made high school in 3.5 years. And as a senior in chemistry, Mr. McDougall, his name was, he'd been in the First World War, and he was a very militant man when he came to Bradley as high school principal. His motto was be straight, mentally, morally, and physically. I always remember that. And I had him for general science and chemistry. And one of the things we had to do in chemistry was to write papers on different metals. Well, of course, our library, Bradley, was just a scanty. But the big library was in Kankakee. So I went to Kankakee Library after supper at night. I'd get the 6:30 streetcar to Kankakee, and then I'd walk down to the library and get the books, reference things, to write these papers. And somehow, of course, Leo knew that my dad was head of the streetcar line. And he would always kind of hang around because Dad had an office at the bank in Kankakee and an office at the car barns in Bradley. Now, the streetcar line at that time was it was run by 5 men. What do you call that? All I want to say is warehouse. But the stockholders were 5 men, and the one man was Governor Len Small, Senator Louis Beckman, W.W. Byrd, B.B. Ferris, and August Radke, who was the head of the biggest brewery in Kankakee. It was down by the Kankakee River, you know, where the dam goes over the river. Those were the 5 shareholders. And then Dad was superintendent of the streetcar line. Oh, what's making me remember all these things? And it's just as vivid as it was.
So did he follow you to the library in Kankakee or
No.
go by the office or?
I would go to I'd get the 6:30 car. I didn't have to pay to ride the streetcar because my dad was a big boss. But here I had my books and my notebooks and everything that I had to work. And the library closed at 9 o'clock. So I could give those 2 hours to looking up the reference work that I wanted. And if I left the library at 10 minutes of 9, I could walk back up to the streetcar line and get the 9 o'clock car to go home. So I had the thing all laid out. Well, one night when I came out of the library, I saw the moon parked out in front. And I thought, how, when, where, how come? And it was Leo. And of course, when he saw me walking from the door of the library, he got out and started to meet me and wanted to know if I wanted to ride home. And I said, how did you ever find? Well, he never did tell me. And then...
Well, he had his eye on you.
Oh, yeah. Right in the very beginning, but I didn't know it. And then he'd drive by our house. And Mom had a way of, she'd want to know who brought you home, who brought you home. And I didn't tell her what his name was. And I'd say, oh, it's just the man in the moon. And I wasn't lying. He was driving a moon car.
Right.
And the man in the moon, well, finally she just wanted to know who this man in the moon was. And then the one night when he pulled up to the curbing and got out of the car and left his cap in the car, and he came up to the drive, and Mom was sitting in the porch swing, and I was with her. And I thought, here we go, Wilma, it's now or never. So when he came up, I introduced him to Mama. She acknowledged it. And there was a rocking chair, and she asked him if he wouldn't like to sit down, and he did. And we talked for a little while. But then I got up and left with him. And then I told you about the night that he came out with his Harley Davidson and was going to take me for a ride. Oh, that night my mother said, you're not going anywhere with that boy.
Well, she did.
Well, they'd oiled the street that day because that was the days before the streets were paved.
Right.
We did
to
have...
keep the dust down?
Oh, yes, and it was in July and hot. Oh, goodness. And I knew that he was going to come out to take me for a ride. He had a sidecar on that Harley Davidson. And he was going to come out and take me for a ride. And that was fine with me. But I didn't know they were going to oil the streets that day. So I was sitting out there on the street in the porch swing with my mother. And I knew that car, I knew the headlights. When they turned off of Broadway, I thought I would know when he was coming. But this night when he came underneath the street light, he lifted that sidecar up in the air and came down with it up in the air, and my mother saw that. And now imagine that street was smelly, the heat of the day, and that hot tar and that oil. And when she saw that sidecar up in the air, and that's where I would sit, and she said, you're not going anywhere with that boy tonight. He pulled up to the curbing and lowered the seat car and got out, and of course he had chaps over his trousers so it wouldn't interfere in the wheels. And he came up and sat down. They said, well, do you want to go now? And I said, Leo, I'm afraid I can't go for a ride tonight. There went all my bravado. But I didn't go with him, and he said, well, he understood, and he'd go home and get the car. So he went home, and he had the family car, he had a Model T, and he had his motorcycle. His folks were quite well-to-do, because, you know, in those days, we didn't play the stock market or anything like that.
Right.
Those people that came over, foreigners, they put their money in real estate. And they owned several properties in Kankakee. They were quite, and they were strong Republicans. And Leo's mother spoke 5 languages. And I can remember at election time, everybody wanted her to work for him, the chief of police. I can remember there was one guy, there was a motorcycle cop, Clarence Roos, and boy, he was a handsome guy. And he kind of took a liking to me. Now imagine, I was just in high school.
Right.
And he didn't like Leo, and I'd have a date with Leo like tonight. And then tomorrow night's Republican. I'd see where Leo Chinski at 561 North Washington Avenue had been picked up for speeding, or no tail light, or one headlight out. And it was Clarence Roos. He was just waiting for Leo after we'd have a date. Then he'd pick him up on his way home and arrest him.
Oh.
Well, Leo's mother, as I say, they were strong Republicans, and Chief Cantlin was head of the police in Kankakee. Leo was never charged with anything. He never had to pay a fine or anything. Because I think, well, she could always get him off. But he wasn't guilty of some of those things.
Right.
But Clarence Roos just wanted to edge him over a little bit.
Right.
But I can remember one time Leo's mother couldn't drive, and of course I drove everywhere. And she left to go out in the country and pick mushrooms, and she knew how to tell them. And I'd take her out, and she was going to teach me how to know mushrooms from toadstools. And when I went out with her, and I listened to how she told me how to differentiate between a toadstool, and finally I told her, I said, I was calling her Mrs. Chinski at that time, but I told her, I said, you pick the mushrooms, I'll clean them, you bring them up to me, but I won't pick them, because I couldn't tell a mushroom from a toadstool.
Right.
I said, you pick them and bring them up, and I'll clean them and put them in the basket. And that's what we did. But that was fine with her. And then I used to go over to Joliet shopping. That was a lovely place to go for. They had stores like Walmart, and you get good bargains. And she loved to go over there shopping. And sometimes I'd take a couple of my sisters, but if I took them, I'd always stop and pick her up. And she did love that. And I can always remember one day we were over there, and there was a man on the corner begging. And she kind of dropped behind Maud and Ines. But I was keeping an eye on her because she wasn't walking right straight with us. But I saw her stop, and she put must have been a dollar bill in his cup. And she came and she didn't say anything about it. But don't you know, when we got home that day, and I pulled up in front of the house, and she got out of the car, she reached down and picked up a bill that somebody had dropped on the ground.
Oh, Marta gave it back to her.
That's what Inez said that afterwards. She said, you know, she said I thought about that so many times, that she gave that man money, and she came home, and well, but her house was marked as far as hobos were concerned. They would always stop at her house.
I thought you said she'd fed a lot of people.
She would feed them. She would never give them money. And I know when she died, that's what the minister said, that she never.
She was by the railroad tracks, wasn't she? Or?
No, but the railroad tracks were some distance from them. But I think they had her house marked.
Yeah.
And I know one day she came over and she was laughing, and she said, the man had stopped that morning and all he wanted was a bar of soap. I think I told you that. And he didn't want any food. He just wanted to know if he had a piece of soap she could have. And she thought that was such a funny thing. And what he wanted it for, he was wearing a hat, and the band, you know, the men had bands around their ribbon or something. And I suppose he needed it when he was riding the rails and in the hot sun, and that had gotten all stained with perspiration, and he thought he could take it off and wash it. And she thought that was such a funny request, just a piece of soap.
Yeah, wasn't she afraid?
Huh?
Wasn't she afraid of people coming to the door?
Oh, she'd never let them in the house. They had an old-fashioned back porch. And I can remember of times when I would go over there, there'd be a strange man sitting out there. Well, not all the time, but there were times when, the first couple of times when I thought, what's going on? And it was someone had stopped for food. She would always feed them, but she did it on the back porch. And Joanne and I, when we lived in Chicago Heights, one night my sister and her husband and Donald were up visiting us for the weekend, and we had a hobo. We had a nice house. But this man stopped and wanted to know, he was kind of youngish, and he wanted to know if we could give him some food. And we had a little back porch that was covered. And I was getting supper that night, and I remember we had pork chops, breaded pork chops. And I had a plant stand that I set out on that back porch, and I put a kitchen towel over, you know. I always embroidered my kitchen towels in those days. I spread it over, and then I fixed his plate. I can remember it was mashed potatoes and a breaded pork chop, and Leo asked him to come up on the porch. Leo was home too because I was getting ready for supper. And that man was so thankful, that man. I mean, we never saw him again, of course. But he thanked us again and again and again for that supper. I'll bet it was the best all-around meal he'd had in a long time, because we gave him just exactly everything that we were having for supper. You know, when I look back when I was younger, and to think how I am today, I'm getting to be such a recluse. I live in this room.
Right. Did you marry Leo right after high school?
Oh,
I thought you talked about going to college
yes.
when you were married.
Well, you see, my sister lived in Champaign-Urbana, and I got my teacher's training at ISNU, which is a branch of the University of Illinois system. Yeah, when Leo and I wanted to get married, my dad didn't, he said, Mom, he said, I want you to finish your education. And I said, well, can't I finish it and go to school? Well, how was I going to work that? Well, Blanche lived, maybe I could stay with Blanche the second year, because you had to live in the dorm the first year as freshman. And I can remember when I went away, Leo, he followed the train. I saw him following the train for a while.
So what year did you get married after the second year of college?
You know, at that time, teachers, a lot of the girls, they would go to summer school. In those days, teachers were, we didn't have, teachers would go to 6-week summer school, and then they could teach on a conditional certificate. And when I went straight through, so that I got all my weeks in that I needed for my training. And I didn't have to go to summer school. I just went down and stayed the board. First year I was in the dormitory. The second year I lived out on campus. But I had the loveliest couple, Cleta Haar, and he was a book salesman for McKnight Book Company. And they took me in just as a daughter. And when they found out I could play the piano, oh boy. They invited me for Sunday dinner, and I went to church with them. And after we were married, when he was in Kankakee one afternoon, he called me. And I don't know if he had customers in Kankakee, but he looked me up, and I invited him for supper. And Leo and I had a three-room apartment. It was a nice apartment. We had a bedroom, a living room, and a kitchen with a big built-in pantry. And he came up and had dinner with us, or supper with us. And I know she wrote in my autograph book, she said, sometimes you're happy, sometimes you're bad, sometimes you're happy, sometimes you're sad, sometimes you're scrappy, and sometimes you're bad. But in all good time, whether it's something, it was the loveliest. And you know, when they sold the house, my autograph book disappeared, and I told Joanne, I said, what in the world? Well, Mom, she said, you weren't there to tell us what you wanted and what you didn't want. So they threw it away, and so many of the boys, Wilma, dear, I think one boy, Fred Strange, used him someplace. One wrote, just play honey and think of me. They all wrote something about my piano playing. And I know, in the second year off campus, I roomed with the cars, or with the, and I had to eat at the Olson Club. Well, Mrs. Olson died, so all the people that ate there, we had to scatter someplace else to get our meals. And there was an Olson Club down the street that was very popular. They had so many of the kids, because after supper at night, they could let the kids dance, in the dining area. It was big and hardwood floors. And they'd let the kids play around till around 7 o'clock or something, and then we had to go home back to where we lived to study. But that one night, I was down there eating, and there was a girl she was down near St. Louis, Illiopolis, Illinois, down in the southern part of the state. And as she called it, she played the fiddle. And the kids would dance kind of hokum, you know.
Uh-huh.
And they found out I could play the piano. And when I went up to the piano, and then we started to play Honey and popular songs of the day. And Mr. Olson listened to us. And after the second or third night, he came up to me, and he offered to let me eat there free if I would play the piano, because Tilly and I were attracting people. They all wanted to come to the Olson Club to eat because we had such a good time after dinner at night.
Uh-huh.
But after everything cooled down, I went back to Olson's. But I could remember when I could eat supper there for free because we were an attraction. And Tilly said, "Oh, I wonder whatever happened to her."
I don't know.
I don't either.
Did Leo like to dance?
Leo didn't know one. No, he didn't.
Uh-huh.
In the kitchen in Jefferson sometimes, I tried to teach him, but he wanted to learn.
Uh-huh.
And Leo had a beautiful singing voice, but he couldn't read a note of music. And I know the minister summer furniture, how he did it.
Uh-huh.
He did a chair over for me when we lived on,
Oh, sorry.
that's okay. And Marilyn and Bill Lomax lived across the street from us. And when Marilyn saw the chair he did for me, she said, "Oh, Wilma, do you think he would?" Well, he did a chair for them just simply because we were neighbors.
Uh-huh.
And the word got around and then Mark Lines they came and wanted work. Leo could have gone into business here just doing that type of work. But he says, "I'm retired."
And anyway, you made baby clothes and put it in the hope chest?
Yeah, you know, when I made diapers,
Uh-huh.
and the cedar chest smelled so clean and nice, and there was a bag of cedar chips that came with it. I put everything, the little nightgowns. One day at our house, my mother, my sisters, my mother, my aunt all came over, and they were sewing baby clothes that day for me. And I can remember my mother making those little tiny buttonholes, because the little dresses, the little princess slips had two little buttons here, just little teensy-weensy buttons. And she made the buttonholes. And all I did that day was make dinner. And I remember I baked a lemon meringue pie. And everybody said that was the best meringue pie they'd ever tasted. And every time, and that was Leo's favorite. Soft pie was lemon meringue. And apple pie was his best two-crust pie. But he always liked cheese or whipped cream or ice cream with that.
So I had to turn the tape over, Wilma.
Oh,
Anyway, Leo made the wing chair when you were expecting, and then he made one for the neighbor.
No, he made one for my brother.
Your brother.
He didn't make that chair for neighbors, for outsiders.
Oh,
It was just for family.
Family,
And those little chairs are still in existence.
Great.
And Shiloh's got Claude. You know, I mix Shiloh up with Claudia.
Well, that's okay.
I know, but it's confusing sometimes when I see Claudia now. Oh, she made the symphony orchestra in Peoria, and I was waiting to see if she got the audition for it. And when Joanne called me Sunday, she said, "Mother, she has been accepted, and she's third chair in the violin section."
Oh.
And I said, "Really?"
Uh-huh.
And I said, "Well, she's got something to work for now, because first chair is first violinist, but to even think she's in third place."
Right.
And I just hope she studies, because, you know, I watched the Boston Pops Orchestra and the Symphony of Madison,
Uh-huh.
and I look at all those white-haired ladies, old ladies, and they're playing the clarinet, they're playing the violin, they're playing the bass horn, they're playing the cello, and I think, isn't that marvelous that they're that age and they have that talent and they're still able to use it?
Uh-huh.
And I watch the old men that are in there,
Right.
and I think, isn't that wonderful?
It can be a lifelong.
But that's what.
Uh-huh.
And now, you know, since I've been here, I haven't touched a keyboard.
So is Claudia third chair or her daughter?
Oh, Claudia is her mother.
Right. Oh, okay.
is
the daughter,
Lauren's mother.
Lawrence, the one in the symphony?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
Mm-hmm. But
Why
I did.
don't you touch the keyboard, Wilma?
I don't know. I don't know. It just seems like I love music, but I don't like this rap. What they call music now to me is just a lot of noise. There's no music. There's no melody to it. Now, you know, I used to play. I love George Gershwin, and I played his song, "Someone to Watch Over Me," and I love "Sophisticated Lady," and I had that music. And when they sold, Leo made me the loveliest music cabinet, and when I was organist at church, I had hymn books for every church in Jefferson. Episcopal, I was even called on some Sundays when their organist couldn't show up. And I can remember the first time I went, I stopped at the church and picked up my robe to wear, but we didn't wear a hat in our church. And when I got to the Episcopal church, and the lady said, "Didn't you bring a cap?" And I said, "No." I didn't know that of course, they're just a step down from the Catholic church. And she worked around till she got me a skull cap, and I put that on with my black robe. But I had hymn books from every church in town, because Betty and I were called for St. Mark's, English Lutheran. The only ones we didn't work was the Lutheran, is it the Wisconsin Synod or the Wisconsin Lutheran?
Missouri Synod?
Well, there's one that's real strict, that they won't allow boys to be Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts. No fraternal organization at all. But St. Mark's English Lutheran Church, we were there. And the Christian Science, Shiloh was soloist for the Christian Scientist Church in Fort Atkinson. We took her down every Wednesday so she could practice with Mr. Erickson. Both girls took piano lessons, but neither one carried it out, but Shiloh had a beautiful voice. She went to the Whitewater every year, and she got starred A ratings, and the one year that she could have gone to national was the year her eyes flew up. She couldn't go. But she had the most beautiful. At first they didn't know she was a soprano, but they didn't know what range she was going to be in. And the first year she went, Dr. Lawrence from Lawrence University was her judge. And the man she was working with was working on his doctorate over at the University of Madison. And he came out that Saturday morning to play for her. And Leo and I were sitting in the back of the auditorium listening. And as soon as she started to sing, I knew her breathing. She was nervous, and I could tell because I played for her at home when we practiced, and I knew her breathing was wrong. But what was his name? He was from Lawrence University. He was her judge, and when he sent her card back to the high school, he said, "Real talent here, to be very careful who she studied with, that they didn't ruin it by going too fast, too soon." And her voice was full. You thought she was an older woman. I can remember one night she was singing for an Oddfellow meeting, and we were waiting for the dignitaries to come from Chicago, and the meeting was getting low, so they started the meeting. I was the organist in the Oddfellows, or Rebecca's, and we started the meeting, and as she got up to sing, these dignitaries arrived in the outer room, but they weren't ushered in, but they could hear her singing. And when they came in and were introduced and acknowledged, they made comment. They said they were so surprised when they came in. They'd heard that beautiful voice, but they thought it was a much older person, and they came in to see it was just a young high school girl. And I know I had compliments on my playing, too, when I was Eastern Star, because when we'd have inspection, they would all go out and I can remember that one night the visiting dignitary, after she acknowledged, and while they were out, I played Tannhauser's Evening Star, and she made mention of it. But the lodge was so fortunate to have an organist, because she had enjoyed the music while we were waiting for the inspection to begin.
I know one time you told me about Shiloh's vision. How old was she when she had that?
When that started, we found out when she was in the first grade. When she came home from school, I got her, you know, in those days they didn't give a report card. The teacher would always give a report.
Yeah.
And she did excellent in everything but reading.
Uh-huh.
And I couldn't understand because at night I would sit on the Davenport with my arm around each girl. And I loved to read Aesop's fairy tales to them
Oh, yeah.
because there was always a moral to the story.
Right.
And when Miss Colette sent that note forward, she said, when her reading was just, I thought, that can't be.
Uh-huh.
Her retentive powers were just wonderful. She could remember what I'd read. And I thought, what's wrong here? So I went to the school to talk to the first grade teacher, and she said, well, she sits in the back of the room. She said, maybe she doesn't see. She says, I'll move her up closer to the front of the room, and then I'll watch her more closely. Well, she did, but that didn't help anything.
Uh-huh.
And finally, we took her for an examination, and we took her, you know, Leo had one eye that was injured when he was 10 years old.
Uh-huh.
Those days the boys were playing cops and robbers, but they didn't have guns. They used sticks, and he was injured. One of the boys stuck his eye with a stick,
Oh.
and he went, well, that's another story. But we went down to Kankakee, back to the doctor that took care of him, and he examined her, and he said it was just a lazy eye. I was to cover that good eye up with a patch and make her use this eye.
Right.
But that didn't work. And we finally ended up taking her to Madison, where she had Dr. Neff. And she was over in the hospital for a week. And I'm telling you, they ran every test on her. It was that hard when we had to leave her over in the hospital at night. And they ran every test. And finally, we took her home. They called us on Friday morning and said we could come and pick our little girl up, but not to leave the hospital. Dr. Neff, the ophthalmologist, and Dr. Gans, the pediatrician, don't leave the hospital without seeing both doctors.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Gans, the pediatrician, said physically she's a beautiful child. Dr. Gans came in and said it's a degeneration of the retina.
Uh-huh.
There we had it. And she was over there for a week. But the funny part of it was she was such a smart little cookie. She said in the morning the doctors would all come up and line around the foot of her bed, and they would all discuss. Dr. Neff told us at the time, he said, I've only seen one other case like this, and it was a little boy down in Winnetka, Illinois.
Uh-huh.
And of course we told Mama right away. We wanted to know if there was any history of anything like that in our family. And of course she didn't, because he said it was either congenital or familial. And she wasn't aware of anything. But that's what it was. And then they told us that could have been happened generations back.
Uh-huh.
And she was out of school one whole year that I taught her at home. And
I'm surprised they didn't let you stay at the hospital with her.
well,
She
it was a
so
good,
small.
I couldn't have done any good. And there was another older woman in the room with her.
Oh.
And that other older woman, now here's the crock, Shiloh would take her to the bathroom.
Uh-huh.
And that woman told us afterward she was such a joy because she visited with the older woman.
Right.
Because she'd been around Grandma Windal and Grandma
Right.
Chinski, and she was such a bubbly little girl, and she was so pretty. And to look at her, you wouldn't think there was anything wrong with her eyes.
Uh-huh.
They were big brown eyes, and her hair was naturally curly, and she wore bangs, and we always dressed her nicely, and she had good manners. She got that. And but Mrs. Goodnow was her name. And I think when she left, she gave Shiloh a $1 bill.
Oh.
Because I really think she was company for this older lady.
Right.
And Shiloh made friends with a little colored girl that was in the ward. One day when I was over there, they wanted to take me down to show me where this little colored, Dixie I think her name was, they wanted to show me her bed. And that was the first time I was ever in a ward. And when I got in, there were so many beds, and they were all separated by little white curtains.
Uh-huh.
And Shiloh was in a private room. And but that little girl was so bubbly. I wonder whatever happened to her. But Shiloh and Joe, they just got along beautifully. They were friends.
Uh-huh.
And, you know, they'd roam the corridors. I don't know.
Yeah.
But after that, when she was, we got along beautifully with everything at home teaching. The only thing she had trouble with was arithmetic. The multiplications, she could memorize them because I said her retentive powers were wonderful. But when fractions, to see them.
Right.
And at first they thought, Dr. Neff said, he thought they'd be able to save her with telescopic lens, and that possibly the vision would be 20/70. Well, you know that's not. But and when she was in, she got through grade school when it popped up in sixth. She didn't. Let's see. She didn't go to. She finished the 6th grade when it popped up again, and she was out all during the 7th year. Then she went back during the 8th year, and then it popped up again when she was a sophomore in high school. I can remember staying up till 2 o'clock in the morning reading Shakespeare to her so that she would pass the English. But then when she went away to college, it would have taken her an extra year, where a lot of the kids were getting through 4 years. It would take her extra time because she couldn't carry the full load. And she had different lenses than they had. But then she didn't finish because Jim was ahead of her in school, and he was at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville, and the war came along, and they wanted to get married. And Leo and I didn't want that. And the only request we made of her was, don't come back to us later on and say you never finished college, because you had the opportunity, but you and Jim wanted to get married. And she told me afterward, she said, Mother, because she lost him when he was 60 years old.
Right.
But he left her with 2 beautiful kids, and they're smart. And she said, Mother, she said, we're so glad that you and Daddy blessed our marriage. Because she said, if we wouldn't have gotten married then, we never would have gotten married. His dad owned a drugstore in Jefferson. It was Miller Drugs. And his mother was a school teacher.
Well, she probably might have married him later. She just probably thought that he would have passed by and got someone else.
I don't think when he was down there at school, he was president of the senior class. And of course he was supposed to lead the grand march for the prom. And he wouldn't pick a girl from school. He wanted Shyla. And she was out at the University of South Dakota. And he wanted to know if she could come from South Dakota to Platteville to be his queen.
Oh, I see.
And I'm telling you, Franklin called me. Frank, that's his father. And he said, Wilma, have you heard that Jim wants Shyla to come down? And he said, what do you feel? How do you and Leo feel about it? And I said, well, it's a long way to go. But I said, they're young. But I said, I don't know. Leo and I haven't discussed it because I wanted to know more about it. Well, we found out that if she would come down, she would stay with the coach and his wife. And so I knew that it wouldn't be one of these free things. And we let her go. And I can remember when the train came in from South Dakota that night, Leo and I met the train at Madison. Oh, I've had such a full life. But she went down and she was his prom queen. No, and when they were in high school, she was a cheerleader too when she was in school. And Dr. Neff didn't think that was a very good idea for her eyes because with all that dust, on the basketball floor and everything. But her dad said, well, he said, I'm not going to take that away from her. That's one thing she enjoys. And he said, I'm going to let her have it because we didn't know what the outcome of this thing was going to be. She may have gone blind. That's what it was all over Jefferson when the report came back when she was out of school that Shyla Chinski was going blind. My telephone was ringing off of the hook. People calling from church. Was it true? Oh, yeah. I've been talking. See how husky my voice is
I know. Do you want some more water?
No, there's something. Good boy, I was scared to death. And then when we lived in Dallas, Texas, and Joanne had the convulsion, And we were out at the airport that day, Love Field. It was so hot. And we wanted to get out because all the planes stopped at Love Field. And a lot of times you'd see very famous people when they were coming in. And we just wanted to go out for a Sunday afternoon. But I knew that Joanne was running a temperature. But I didn't know it was anything. And I was sitting in the back seat, and I had her laying out on the seat because I didn't want to hold her, because my body heat would make her warmer, and it was so hot. And Joanne and Shyla sat in the front seat with her dad, and she was in a strap. And I looked down, and she was frothing at the mouth, and I thought, oh my God, is that a convulsion? Is that a spasm? We ended up that Sunday afternoon in the hospital where President Kennedy was taken when he was shot, where he died. And I can remember when we went into that hospital, we went into the emergency entrance, and on the floor it was just laid with Mexicans and colored people.
Oh, really?
Well, down there, you know, there was Elm Street was where the Mexicans and the colored people, and they were bloody, and they'd get in knife fights. Oh. But when they saw us come in, we were white, and we had this infant in our arms. We were taken right into a room, and there were two doctors right there, and they took the baby and laid her on the table, and I went around the table on the other side, so I was looking at them directly so I could watch them. And the next thing I knew, there was a little nurse came in, and she pushed a stool underneath me, and I sat down, and they started to take her things off. They wanted to get her temperature. Of course, she was in the height of the convulsion right at that time. And that little nurse came back. I'll never forget this, Nancy. That little nurse, I hadn't paid much attention to her, but she came back and she had a glass of water, and it had ammonia in it.
Oh.
I could smell the ammonia. I must have been near the place of passing out on them. And she told me to drink it, and I looked up to thank her, and she looked just like my baby sister, Genevieve.
Oh.
And that just woke me up.
What was the convulsion about, Wilma?
Well, she was running such a high convulsion. She was running high temperature, and she was teething. And the next day we found a pediatrician, and he said teething wouldn't cause a convulsion. That was just a natural process like getting your fingernails or anything. Well, when we went back north, I took her right straight out to see Dr. Goodwin, the doctor who delivered her. And I said she was teething, and this doctor, whatever his name was, said the teething wouldn't cause a convulsion. He said, Wilma, if you go back, you can tell him from me, use my name, and tell him he's a damn liar. When they're teething, they run temperatures so high that it can throw them into a convulsion.
Oh. And she didn't have any lasting damage from it?
Well, they didn't dismiss us that night until it was after 9 o'clock, and I can remember they wrapped her in a big green wool blanket. And oh, how she perspired when she came out of that crazy thing. She was just, and they kept her there. I think they thought maybe she might go into another one. But they kept her there until, I suppose they thought it was safe to take her home. And I took her home, and I got in bed with her that night, and I slept with her. I slept like this, so I could keep an eye on her, and kept feeling her to see that she wasn't having another fever.
You were a good mother, Wilma. You were such a good mother.
I was scared to death. I'd never seen a convulsion before, and I was 1,000 miles away from my mother or sisters, anybody I could talk. But the strangers were so good to us. But I think partly because we were white. Because when I remember all those men, and they were dirty, and they'd been fighting and talking in languages I didn't understand, and how we didn't have to wait a minute. As soon as they saw us, they took us right in. And you know, I never got to say thank you to any of them. I just accepted their kindness and their goodness. I was petrified with fear.
Right. I forgot how come you were in Texas.
How come? Leo was transferred. He was with Kraler. See, that's who he was working with when I met him. And Kraler at that time was the world's largest manufacturer of upholstered furniture. That was when upholstered furniture, well, they could, that KD that I had, that I told you they lifted up That was the first living room furniture, but that was wood, and it was cold. But everything was oak in those days. Our dining room table was an oak table with a pedestal base, and when Mama put leaves in it so there'd be room for all of us. And but when upholstered furniture came back, oh boy, that was a luxury. Beautiful material, and it was soft, and Leo was working he was running messages, and when he ran by when he'd have to take messages from the office, because there was no intercom or anything like that, he'd take an order from the office, maybe to the wood department or to the sewing department, because the sewers, the women had one department, the springers had another one, the upholsterers, the people put on arms, the people who put on backs. Well, that's a story in itself. And the thing that got Leo was when he would watch him spit tacks, because they used a magnetic hammer, and they'd pick up a handful of those tacks and put them in their mouth, and then they'd go like this.
Oh, and they'd take them out of their mouth.
And he was one of the fastest, and that was the thing that intrigued him. He liked that better than taking messages, and he wanted to know if he couldn't watch them and if they'd teach him. Well, they did, and he got to be one of the fastest when they were taking him around, using him as an example how fast. Maybe you ever noticed he's got two front teeth. They were nice.
One was kind of...
They kind of slanted. But his teeth were strong, but it was with that hammer. They don't do that anymore. They use a staple gun.
Right.
But he had all that stuff. I'll tell you, he upholstered all my furniture. He upholstered the girls' furniture. No, he did it for friends. And he did such beautiful work. Because as I say, if it was striped material or a plaid, it had to match perfectly. And I'd know him at night. He would be restless at night, and I'd say, "Can't you sleep?" Well, he was working about a job he was doing, and he was just wondering how he was going to get this put around that curve.
He was very dedicated.
Well, it was that fascination for that magnetic hammer and getting them. And he never swallowed a tack, but some of the men did.
Oh.
And then they'd spit the tacks out.
That'd be frightening.
I can remember those little tacks. They were little, and how they would glisten in the sun. And of course, when they'd spit them out, they were covered with saliva. No, I could write a book about my life, I believe. And I think it might be sort of interesting to some people. Because it's all down to earth stuff.
I know we're skipping around a lot, but didn't you come back from there? And
we came back from there. My oldest sister that I told you lived in Champaign, Urbana. And she and her family were on their way home on Mother's Day. They were coming up driving. They were going to have a late dinner or an early supper with my mother and father for Mother's Day. And on their way to Kankakee, they had a head-on collision with a doctor who was out with another woman, and they had been drinking. And they ended up... Come here. Come here.
Oh, hello, I didn't know someone was in...
anyway, they had the head-on collision.
Yes. And the funny part of it was a call. They were caught between Watsika, it was an accident on the way. They called for every available ambulance because there was a big family. They had a big family. But it was funny, they took Blanche and all the boys to a hospital in one town, and they took Henry and the girls to a hospital in another town.
Oh my.
So, and then they called us. They said for us, they said if there's any family members that want to see them, I think you better get in touch with them. So they called us, and we were in Dallas. And Leo took a 6-week leave of absence, and we started home the next morning with 2 babies. And we drove right straight through. When we came by the airport, my baby sister and her husband, they knew that we'd come in through town that way, and they were sitting out there waiting for us. And we saw them when we stopped just briefly. But then we went on into Kankakee. And I can remember taking my mother, I'd go to one place, and Leo would take my dad I don't know, when my dad saw my sister that night, they wouldn't let him see her. And he said, I'm her father, I'm going in. And her jaw, I don't know, was voted. It was a head of collision, and she had Ruth Marilyn in her arms, and she bent over to protect Ruth, and she got it on the top of her head.
Oh.
She was always crippled after that. 1 foot.
Were all the children hurt too?
Oh, yeah. I don't, Clarence wasn't with her. Henry D. was with her. John Robert, Ruth Marilyn. And I know when they came out, Vern, they called my brother Vern and told him there'd been an accident. And he came out home where Mom and Papa were waiting for them, you know, to come for supper. And he just went in and he told them that he'd had the call that there'd been an accident and what had happened. And my dad got right up and he was going with Vern, and that's when he went. And he said when he walked by the room where Blanche was, he said he didn't know it was Blanche. She was so disfigured. He walked right past, and they wasn't going to let him see her. And he said, I'm going to see her, I'm her father. And then when we got there and I went to see her, I didn't know her. She had just like inner tubes around her head, you know, top of her head, around her chin. And I wouldn't have recognized her.
But did she cut it?
Henry had broken legs. I wonder whatever happened. Whatever happened. Because you see, we were from out of town. I don't know if there was any lawsuits or any. I don't know. I don't think that woman. What did she?
I think she put quite a bit of ice in there. You want some more water, Wilma? When was it you did some modeling?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's in there for you.
Huh?
Was that after you moved
Oh
up
no,
here?
that was earlier on when I was going into Milwaukee. I went back to substitute teaching, and I went into Milwaukee. I wanted to get a suit, and I went in looking for a suit that day. And I think I know it was at Gimbel's, and I tried a gray gabardine on. I loved that, and that was when I thought. And while I put it on to see if it fit, the clerk went out and she bought another suit in, and she said, would you try this one on for me? And it was a beige, it was gabardine, and it was a beautiful suit. It was over $100. And I put it on and it fit, and she said, just wait a minute. And she went out and she came in with some man. And he wanted me to walk in it. And he just wanted me to model it for him. Because it was a beautiful suit. I ended up buying it. It was $100 and some bucks. But it was all lined with real light beige, crepe de chine. And when I did that at noon at Gimbel's, I used to have a tea room. And a lot of the women that worked would go in there for lunch. And he wanted to know if I would be interested in modeling during the lunch hour. Suits, that sort of thing. And I said, well, I don't live in town. I live out of town. Well, he said, we'd make it worth your while if you care to just come up and model suits so the other women, while they're eating, they could see what we have on. And I did. So I bought that gray suit. And do you know Joanne? And I had a trench coat. Oh, God, I love that trench coat. And I wore that one day when I was in Mayville. And I went over to Beaver Dam. I wanted to buy some long socks for Leo. You know, so when he went to Masonic meetings or something, he wouldn't show bare legs. And I was in there buying those knee highs for him. And the man clerk wanted to know where I got that coat. And I said, I bought it in Milwaukee. I said, it's a German import. He said, I know. He said, it's a good-looking coat. He said, that's why I asked you where you got it. And Joanne wore that coat when she went to Europe.
Oh, that's great.
Because it had the prettiest plaid lining. And I took it to have a lady cut it off, and she ruined it. And I never wore it after that.
Oh, no.
She didn't cut it straight across. She kind of cut it up in the back. Oh, boy, You know that white robe I got at Penny's?
Right.
That has to have some work done, and I can't find anybody that will do it. We had a woman here. The ties inside were just ribbons.
Uh-huh.
And you know by the time you pull that to hold it,
Right.
they're going to pull out, and I wanted those replaced. And I thought I wanted it shortened a little bit, but I can't find any. Nobody will do any sewing, and I have never worn it. And I sent my other robe home with Joanne. She got that, and it was too big, and this is a small. But I thought with winter coming, I wish I could get it fixed because I wear that seersucker thing that I got from the hospital when I get my whirlpool. And with winter coming, it's because I get that west wind.
Uh-huh.
But I don't want to buy any more clothes.
Uh-huh.
If I could do my own ironing, I would. And I've got all those big heavy stickers
Right.
in the back.
You told me something. Let me just stop and check this a minute.
For your own
Just
edification.
for family history, and maybe Christopher will want to listen to it. But didn't you tell me once about getting the girls each a fancy coat?
Get
When they
what?
were young, they each had a fancy coat. You always did the same thing for each girl? And they had...
Well, I never could get clothes, the coats for them,
Uh-huh.
because they were 4 years difference in age and size.
Uh-huh.
But what would...
Well, I thought you had got them a special jacket or a coat one time, and you said whatever you did for the older daughter,
Well,
you did for
we
the younger.
always did that. They both got their watches at the same time. They were always treated alike. Joanne, when she was in high school, she had a beautiful suede jacket,
Uh-huh.
and it was the prettiest color. But you see, Shiloh was in college,
Uh-huh.
and Shiloh was out of high school when Joanne went in.
Right.
And Shiloh always wore junior house dresses. Her graduation picture, that picture that I've got of Shiloh here in high school, she's got a junior house dress on. And they were good looking. I got those at the Boston store. And I know she had a little camel hair coat. She was a Girl Scout. And she had that little camel hair coat. It was, and the scout party was over at Oconomowoc. Dr. Robinson's wife was one of the leaders of the troop.
Uh-huh.
And Joanne probably fell in the water with that rubber coat. Oh, and then one Easter, I'll tell you another. She had a little blue outfit, the cutest blue hat, when she went to church on Sunday. Well, she went to Sunday school first. And when she was walking over the bridge, she was all dressed up in her Easter outfit. I don't know, I bet that poor little child. And the wind came along and took that little blue hat off,
Oh,
sailed
boy.
it down in the Rock River.
I bet she was horrified.
Oh, she was heartsick. And I guess men on the other side of the bridge were trying to get it, but they couldn't.
Yeah.
And I can remember one other time, on the desk in the den, I had a big plate glass mirror cover the top of the desk. It was a mahogany desk. And
Did you use mirror?